The rain fell in heavy sheets, drumming against the cold stone of the graveyard, as if the heavens themselves were weeping. Alexander stood frozen, his tailored coat soaked through, his breath catching in sharp, uneven gasps. Before him, two small boys, no older than 7, clung to each other, their faces streaked with tears and mud. Their eyes, wide and glistening, locked onto his, and in that moment, the world seemed to tilt. One of them, the smaller one with a scar above his brow, stepped forward, his voice trembling but clear. "Dad," he whispered. "Why didn't you come sooner?" Alexander's knees buckled. He caught himself against the edge of Rebecca's gravestone, the carved letters of her name biting into his palm. "Dad." The word echoed in his skull, sharp and impossible, like a blade slicing through years of carefully buried truths. He didn't know these boys. He didn't know their faces, their names, or the desperate hope in their eyes. Yet, as he stared at them, something deep and primal stirred, a memory he'd locked away, a wound he'd sworn never to reopen. Rebecca. Her grave. These boys. His heart pounded, each beat a question he wasn't ready to answer. How could they know him? How could they call him that? The taller boy, clutching a tattered stuffed bear, spoke next, his voice softer but no less piercing. "Mom said you'd come. She said you always keep your promises." Alexander's throat tightened, and for the first time in years, he felt the sting of tears. Promises. He'd made so many to her, whispered in the dark of their stolen moments, etched in the margins of her journals. But he'd failed her. He'd walked away, convinced she was better off without him, convinced his world of wealth and power would only taint her light. And now, here, in this rain-soaked cemetery, two boys stood before him, claiming a title he'd never dared to imagine. He sank to his knees, the mud seeping into his trousers, his hands trembling as he reached out, then hesitated. The boys didn't flinch. They watched him, waiting, as if they'd been waiting their whole lives. "Who are you?" he managed, his voice raw, barely audible over the rain. The smaller boy tilted his head, his scar catching the faint light from a distant street lamp. "We're Ethan and Lucas," he said simply, as if it explained everything. "Mom told us about you. She said you were a hero." A hero. The word was a knife, twisting deeper. Alexander had been called many things, tycoon, visionary, ruthless, but never that. Not by her. Not after he'd left her to face the world alone, believing his absence was a gift. He looked at the gravestone again, Rebecca's name stark against the worn granite. The date of her death was recent, too recent. A year ago, maybe less. His chest ached with the weight of it. She'd been here, alive, breathing, raising these boys, while he'd been building an empire, drowning in boardrooms and bourbon. And now she was gone, and these boys were all that remained. The rain slowed to a drizzle, but the chill in the air grew sharper. Alexander's gaze drifted to the boys' worn shoes, the holes in their jackets, the way they shivered but stood defiant. They were hers, through and through, her strength, her fire. But why call him Dad? He hadn't seen Rebecca in nearly a decade. Their time together had been brief, a fleeting collision of hearts before he'd convinced himself it could never last. Yet, as he studied their faces, he saw it, the curve of Ethan's jaw, Lucas's piercing eyes. They were his. The realization hit like a tidal wave, stealing his breath, his reason, his carefully constructed walls. "I don't understand," he said, more to himself than to them. His voice cracked, betraying the turmoil within. "How can you be?" He couldn't finish. The smaller boy, Ethan, stepped closer, unafraid, and placed a small, cold hand on Alexander's arm. "Mom kept your picture," he said. "She showed us. She said you'd find us one day." Lucas nodded, clutching his bear tighter. "She wrote about you. In her book. She said you were lost, but you'd come back." Her book. Rebecca's journal. Alexander's mind flashed to the leather-bound notebook she'd always carried, its pages filled with her thoughts, her dreams, her heart. He'd seen her scribble in it during their late-night talks, her pen moving with a quiet intensity. He'd never read it, never dared to. It was her sanctuary, and he'd respected that. But now, the thought of it burned in his mind. What had she written? What truths had she left behind? And why had she told these boys he was their father? The cemetery was silent now, save for the soft patter of rain and the distant hum of traffic. Alexander's hands clenched into fists, his nails digging into his palms. He wanted to run, to flee from this moment, from the weight of their words, from the ghost of Rebecca standing between them. But he couldn't. Not with Ethan and Lucas watching him, their eyes so full of trust, so full of her. He forced himself to stand, his legs unsteady, and looked down at them. "Where do you live?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "Who takes care of you now?" Ethan's face fell, and Lucas looked away, hugging his bear tighter. "We're at the shelter," Ethan said quietly. "Aunt Clara was supposed to take us, but she got sick. They said we might have to go somewhere else soon." A shelter. The words were a punch to Alexander's gut. His sons, living in a shelter, while he slept in a penthouse with views of the city skyline. The injustice of it, the cruelty, made his vision blur with rage and shame. He reached out, this time letting his hand rest gently on Ethan's shoulder. The boy didn't pull away. "You're not going anywhere else," Alexander said, the words spilling out before he could stop them. "You're coming with me." The boys exchanged a glance, a silent conversation passing between them. Lucas's eyes narrowed, wary but curious. "You mean it?" he asked. Alexander nodded, his throat too tight to speak. He didn't know what he was doing, didn't know how to be a father, didn't even know if he could believe their story. But he knew one thing, he couldn't leave them here, alone, in the shadow of Rebecca's grave. The rain had stopped, leaving the air heavy with the scent of wet earth and pine. Alexander took a shaky breath, his mind racing. He needed answers, about Rebecca, about the boys, about the years he'd missed. But for now, he had to focus on them. He shrugged off his coat and draped it over their small shoulders, the fabric swallowing them whole. "Come on," he said softly. "Let's get you warm." Ethan hesitated, then slipped his hand into Alexander's, his fingers small but strong. Lucas followed, still clutching his bear, his steps cautious but steady. As they walked toward his car, Alexander's gaze lingered on the gravestone one last time. Rebecca. Her name was a whisper in his soul, a reminder of everything he'd lost, and everything he might still have a chance to reclaim. The boys' voices broke through his thoughts, soft and uncertain, asking about his car, about where they were going. He answered as best he could, his voice steadying with each word. But inside, a storm raged. Who were these boys, really? And what had Rebecca left behind to lead them to him? The car door closed with a soft thud, and Alexander glanced at the boys in the rearview mirror. They sat close together, Ethan's hand still gripping Lucas's sleeve. They were scared, but they were here. With him. And as he pulled away from the cemetery, the weight of their trust settled over him like a mantle. He didn't know what came next, didn't know how to unravel the mystery of their words or the ache in his chest. But he knew he couldn't turn back. Not now. Not ever. 6 years ago, he'd walked away from Rebecca, believing it was the right thing to do. He'd told himself she deserved better, that his world would only break her. But as he drove through the rain-slicked streets, the boy's quiet breathing filling the car, he wondered if he'd been wrong all along. What had happened in those years? What had she faced without him? And why, after all this time, had fate brought him to her grave, to these boys who called him Dad? The answers were out there, waiting, and he would find them, no matter what it cost. 6 years ago, the world was a different place for Alexander. He was younger then, not yet the titan of industry he'd become, but already hardened, his heart encased in a shell of ambition and solitude. The city buzzed around him, a symphony of lights and noise, but he moved through it like a ghost, untouched by its warmth. He'd built walls high and thick, convinced that love was a luxury he couldn't afford, a distraction from the empire he was forging. That was before Rebecca. Before the night that changed everything, though he didn't know it then. It was a late autumn evening, the air sharp with the promise of winter. Alexander had been dragged to a charity gala by his cousin, a rare concession to family obligations. The ballroom glittered with chandeliers and false smiles, the kind of place where wealth wore a mask of generosity. He hated it, the small talk, the posturing, the way every glance was a calculation. He'd planned to slip out early, to retreat to his penthouse and the silence he preferred. But then he saw her. She was a waitress, moving through the crowd with a tray of champagne flutes, her steps careful but not cautious. There was a quiet grace to her, a steadiness that stood out against the room's artifice. Her dark hair was pulled back, a few strands escaping to frame her face, and her eyes, God, those eyes, held a warmth that made something in Alexander's chest tighten. She wasn't like the others here, all polish and pretense. She was real, and it unsettled him. He watched her from the edge of the room, his glass untouched, as she navigated the sea of tuxedos and gowns. Then it happened, a clumsy guest, too deep in his wine, bumped into her, sending her tray crashing to the floor. The sound of shattering glass cut through the hum of conversation, and for a moment, the room's attention turned to her. Alexander expected her to shrink, to stammer apologies, but she didn't. She knelt, gathering the shards with steady hands, her face calm despite the whispers around her. Something about her resolve, her refusal to be diminished, drew him closer. Without thinking, he crossed the room and crouched beside her, picking up a piece of broken glass. She looked up, startled, her eyes meeting his for the first time. "You don't have to," she said softly, her voice low and clear, like a note struck in a quiet room. "I do," he replied, though he didn't know why. They worked in silence, their hands brushing once, twice, as they cleared the mess. When it was done, she stood, smoothing her apron, and offered him a smile, not the practiced kind, but one that felt like a gift. "Thank you," she said. Most people wouldn't bother. He wanted to say something clever, something to keep her there, but words failed him. She was already moving away, her tray replaced, her focus back on the crowd. He caught her name from the tag on her uniform, Rebecca, and it lodged in his mind like a stone in a riverbed. For the rest of the night, he found himself watching her, stealing glances as she poured drinks, laughed with a coworker, moved with that quiet strength. She was a stranger, yet he felt tethered to her, as if some invisible thread had been tied between them. Later, as the gala wound down, he saw her outside, standing under the awning to avoid the drizzle that had started to fall. She was counting tips, her brow furrowed, her lips moving silently as she tallied the bills. He approached, his steps deliberate, though his heart raced in a way that felt foreign. "Long night?" he asked, leaning against a pillar. She glanced up, surprised but not flustered. "Longer than most," she said, tucking the money into her bag. "But it pays the rent." There was no self-pity in her voice, only fact, and it struck him how different her world was from his. He wanted to know more, to know her, but he didn't know how to ask. Instead, he offered her his umbrella, a small, impulsive gesture. "It's wet out there," he said. She hesitated, then took it, her fingers brushing his. "I'll return it," she promised, her eyes holding his for a moment longer than necessary. "Don't worry about it," he said, but he hoped she would. He wanted a reason to see her again. She walked away, disappearing into the rain, and Alexander stood there, the cold seeping into his bones, feeling something he hadn't in years, possibility. He didn't know her story, didn't know the weight she carried or the dreams she held close. But that night, for the first time in a long time, he felt alive. He thought of her smile, her steady hands, the way she'd looked at him, not as a CEO, not as a name on a Forbes list, but as a man. It was a fleeting moment, a spark in the dark, but it lingered, burning quietly in the back of his mind. Days passed, then weeks, and he couldn't shake her. He returned to the venue, hoping to find her, but she wasn't there. The staff said she'd been temporary, filling in for someone else. He felt a pang of regret, sharper than he expected. He told himself it was nothing, that she was just a passing encounter, but the truth was heavier. He'd seen something in her, something he hadn't known he was searching for. And he'd let it slip away. That night at the gala, he hadn't known her name would haunt him. He hadn't known that their brief meeting would plant a seed that would grow into something he couldn't ignore. He hadn't known that years later, he'd stand at her grave, her sons calling him dad, her memory pulling him back to a moment he tried to forget. But as he drove through the city now, Ethan and Lucas asleep in the back seat, he wondered what else he'd missed. What had happened after that night? What had brought Rebecca to him, then torn her away? The answers were out there, in the pages of her journal, in the lives of these boys, in the truths he was only beginning to uncover. And he would find them, even if it meant unraveling everything he thought he knew. The city was a beast of concrete and neon, swallowing dreams as easily as it spat out despair, and Rebecca knew its teeth better than most. 6 years ago, she lived in a world far removed from Alexander's glittering penthouses and boardroom triumphs. Her days began before dawn in a cramped studio apartment, the kind where the walls were thin enough to hear the neighbors' arguments and the radiator hissed more than it heated. The air smelled of damp laundry and instant coffee, and the single window offered a view of a brick wall and a sliver of sky. It was home, though, for her and her younger sister, Clara, who slept on a fold-out couch, her textbooks scattered like leaves across the floor. Rebecca was 24 then, her life a delicate balancing act of survival and hope. She worked 3 jobs, waitressing at a diner, cleaning offices at night, and picking up catering gigs like the gala where she'd met Alexander. Every dollar was accounted for: rent, Clara's tuition, the occasional doctor's visit for their mother, who was fading in a nursing home an hour away. There was no room for error, no space for dreams, but Rebecca carried on, her resolve a quiet fire that burned beneath her exhaustion. She didn't complain. Complaining was a luxury she couldn't afford. That autumn, after the gala, her life felt heavier, though she couldn't say why. The memory of the man who'd helped her pick up broken glass lingered like a song she couldn't forget. His eyes, sharp but kind, had seen her, not the waitress, not the girl scraping by, but her. She replayed their brief exchange, the way his voice had softened when he offered her his umbrella. It was a small thing, foolish to dwell on, but in her world of endless hustle, that moment felt like a pause, a breath she hadn't known she needed. She kept his umbrella, folded neatly in the corner of her closet, its black fabric a reminder of a night when someone had cared enough to notice her. Sometimes, late at night, when Clara was asleep and the city's hum was all she had for company, she traced the handle with her finger, wondering about the man who'd given it to her. She didn't know his name, didn't know he was Alexander Lancaster, the CEO whose face would later grace magazine covers. To her, he was just a stranger with a steady gaze and a kindness that felt rare. Her days blurred into a rhythm of routine. Mornings at the diner, where she poured coffee for truckers and smiled through their tired jokes. Evenings at the office building, where she vacuumed carpets and emptied trash cans, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. On weekends, she'd visit her mother, bringing a thermos of soup and a book to read aloud, though her mother's eyes were often distant, lost in a fog of memory. Clara, bright and stubborn, was Rebecca's anchor, her reason to keep going. "You don't have to do this alone," Clara would say, her voice fierce despite her youth. But Rebecca would only smile and ruffle her hair. "We're a team," she'd reply, though she carried the weight herself. The gala had been a rare break from her grind, a glimpse into a world of wealth she'd never touch. She hadn't expected to feel anything there, hadn't expected to meet someone who'd make her heart stutter. But that night, as she'd walked home under his umbrella, the rain a soft curtain around her, she'd let herself imagine a different life, one where she wasn't always running, always fighting. It was a dangerous thought, one she pushed down as soon as it surfaced. Dreams like that were traps, and she couldn't afford to fall. Still, she held on to a small piece of that night. In her bag, tucked between receipts and a worn notebook, was a single champagne flute she hadn't returned to the caterer. It was chipped, barely noticeable, but it was hers, a relic of the moment when a stranger had knelt beside her, his presence steadying her in a way she hadn't known she craved. She didn't tell anyone about it, not even Clara, who teased her for being sentimental. It was her secret, a quiet rebellion against the grind of her days. One evening, after a double shift, Rebecca sat on the floor of her apartment, her back against the couch, Clara's soft snores filling the room. She pulled out her notebook, the one she called her journal, though it was more a patchwork of thoughts than a proper diary. She wrote about the gala, her words careful, as if afraid to commit too much to the page. "He didn't look at me like I was invisible," she wrote. "For a second, I felt like I mattered." She paused, her pen hovering, then added, "I wonder if he's out there, somewhere, thinking about me too." She didn't expect to see him again. The city was too big, their worlds too far apart. But the thought of him was a spark in her darkness, a reminder that kindness existed, that she could still feel something beyond exhaustion. She tucked the journal away, her fingers brushing the chipped flute in her bag. It was foolish, she knew, to hold on to these things, an umbrella, a glass, a memory. But they were proof that she'd been seen, if only for a moment. As she closed her eyes, the weight of the day pulling her toward sleep, she didn't know that the man from the gala was searching for her, his own life unsettled by their brief encounter. She didn't know that their paths would cross again, that their fleeting connection would grow into something deeper, something that would break her heart and remake it. She didn't know that years later, she'd stand at the edge of her own grave, her sons carrying the weight of her love and her secrets. All she knew, in that quiet moment, was that she wasn't ready to let go of the stranger who'd made her feel alive. And so she held on, to the umbrella, to the glass, to the hope that somewhere, somehow, he hadn't forgotten her either. The city hadn't changed in 6 years, not really. Its pulse was the same, restless, relentless, a machine that ground down the weary and rewarded the ruthless. Rebecca moved through it now as she always had, her steps quick but deliberate, her shoulders squared against the weight of the world. She was older, harder in some ways, softened in others. Motherhood had carved new lines into her face, not of age but of love, of nights spent soothing fevers and weaving stories for 2 boys who were her everything. Ethan and Lucas. They were her light, her reason, even when the days felt like a battle she might not win. She worked at a bakery now, a small place tucked between a laundromat and a pawn shop. The air was thick with the scent of yeast and sugar, and the work was steady, less punishing than the diner or the cleaning gigs. She kneaded dough, iced cakes, and smiled at customers, her hands moving with a rhythm born of necessity. It was honest work, and it kept her boys fed, their shoes replaced when the soles wore thin. But there were moments, in the quiet of the early mornings, when her mind wandered back to that autumn night 6 years ago, to the man who'd knelt beside her, his presence a fleeting anchor in a storm she hadn't named. She didn't dwell on him often. Life didn't allow for that. But sometimes, when she wiped down the counter or folded laundry, her fingers would brush the chipped champagne flute she still kept, hidden in a box under her bed. It was a relic, a piece of a night when she'd felt seen, and though she told herself it was foolish, she couldn't let it go. The umbrella was gone, lost in a move years ago, but the flute remained, its imperfection a mirror of her own. One morning, as she arranged pastries in the bakery's display case, a delivery order came in. It was a big one, a rush job for a corporate event at Lancaster Corp, a name that meant nothing to her beyond its reputation as a titan of the city's elite. She packed the boxes carefully, her hands steady as she stacked croissants and tarts, her mind on the rent due next week. The delivery was across town, and she volunteered to take it, knowing the overtime would help. She didn't think twice about the name on the invoice, Michael Lancaster, until she stepped into the gleaming lobby of the company's headquarters. The building was a cathedral of glass and steel, its air conditioned to a crisp chill that made her feel out of place in her flour-dusted apron. She clutched the boxes, her heart beating a little faster as she approached the reception desk. The woman behind it barely looked up, directing her to the top floor with a flick of her hand. Rebecca rode the elevator alone, the mirrored walls reflecting her tired eyes and the faint scar on her cheek, a memento from a childhood accident. She smoothed her hair, a nervous habit, and told herself to focus. Just deliver the order, get the signature, and go. The elevator doors opened to a hallway lined with sleek offices, the hum of wealth palpable in the polished floors and hushed voices. She found the conference room, its door ajar, and stepped inside. A man stood at the far end, his back to her, his silhouette framed against a wall of windows. He was tall, his suit tailored to a precision that spoke of power, and something about the way he moved, deliberate, controlled, made her pause. She cleared her throat. "Delivery from Sweet Haven Bakery," she said, her voice steady despite the odd flutter in her chest. He turned, and the world slowed. His eyes met hers, and for a moment, she couldn't breathe. It was him. The man from the gala, older now, his jaw sharper, his gaze heavier, but unmistakable. Michael Lancaster. The name on the invoice. The CEO. Her stranger. She felt the boxes slip slightly in her grip and tightened her hold, her knuckles whitening. He stared at her, his expression unreadable, though something flickered in his eyes, recognition, maybe, or confusion. "Set them there," he said, nodding to a table, his voice low and clipped. She nodded, moving mechanically, her mind racing. Did he know her? Did he remember? She placed the boxes down, her hands trembling just enough to betray her. He stepped closer, signing the delivery slip, and their fingers brushed as he handed it back. The contact was brief, electric, and she pulled away, her heart pounding. "Thank you," he said, his tone neutral, but his eyes lingered, searching her face as if trying to place her. She wanted to say something, anything, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, she nodded again, mumbling a quick, "Have a good day," before turning to leave. Her steps were too fast, her breath uneven, and as she reached the elevator, she heard him call out, "Wait." She froze, her hand on the button, and glanced back. He stood in the doorway, the delivery slip still in his hand, his brow furrowed. "Do I know you?" he asked, his voice softer now, almost uncertain. Her throat tightened. She could tell him. She could say, "You helped me 6 years ago. You gave me your umbrella. You made me feel like I wasn't alone." But what would that do? He was a stranger still, a man whose world was galaxies from hers, and she had Ethan and Lucas to think of. "I don't think so," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The elevator dinged, and she stepped inside, the doors closing before he could say more. As the elevator descended, Rebecca leaned against the wall, her heart a storm of what-ifs. She thought of the flute, of the journal where she'd written about him, of the boys who deserved more than her memories. She didn't know if he'd recognized her, didn't know if he'd felt the same jolt she had. But as she stepped back into the city's chaos, she couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted, that their paths, once crossed, were circling back. And though she told herself it was impossible, a part of her wondered if he was out there, right now, remembering the girl from the gala, the one he'd almost seen again. The gala was a glittering affair, a showcase of Lancaster Corp's dominance, where champagne flowed like water and every smile was a transaction. Rebecca stood at the edge of the ballroom, her black apron swapped for a borrowed dress that clung to her frame, a last-minute request from the bakery to help serve at the event. She felt like an imposter, her hands still dusted with the ghost of flour, her heart unsteady from the memory of delivering pastries to Michael Lancaster's office days ago. She hadn't expected to see him again, not so soon, not here, but fate had a way of laughing at her plans. The room buzzed with power, executives in tailored suits, women in gowns that cost more than her rent, their laughter sharp and practiced. Rebecca moved through them, a tray of canapés balanced in her hands, her eyes scanning the crowd for him despite herself. She told herself it was curiosity, nothing more. He hadn't recognized her in his office, or so she thought, and she'd walked away, her heart a tangle of relief and regret. But now, as she wove through the sea of wealth, she couldn't shake the feeling that he was close. He was. Across the room, Alexander stood by a marble pillar, a glass of scotch in his hand, his gaze distant. The gala was a necessity, a stage for deals and alliances, but his mind was elsewhere, caught on the woman from the bakery, the one whose face had stirred something he couldn't name. Her eyes, her voice, they were familiar, like a song he'd heard once and forgotten. He'd replayed their brief encounter, the way her hand had trembled when their fingers brushed, the way she'd hurried away. "Do I know you?" He'd asked, and her answer, "No," had felt like a lie, though he couldn't say why. He saw her before she saw him. She was near the dessert table, setting down her tray, her movements precise but unguarded, her dark hair catching the chandelier's light. His breath caught, a jolt of recognition he couldn't place. He set his glass down and moved toward her, weaving through the crowd, his pulse quickening with each step. She turned as he approached, her eyes widening for a fraction of a second before she schooled her expression into one of polite neutrality. "Good evening," she said, her voice steady, though her hands betrayed her, fidgeting with the edge of her tray. "Can I get you anything?" The question was formal, a server's script, but her eyes held his, and in them, he saw a flicker of something, fear, hope, memory. He stopped a foot away, close enough to catch the faint scent of vanilla on her, close enough to see the scar on her cheek, faint but unmistakable. His mind raced, grasping for a connection he couldn't quite reach. "No, thank you," he said, his voice lower than he intended. He trailed off, unsure of what he meant to say. The noise of the gala faded, the room narrowing to just her. She tilted her head, waiting, and he noticed the way her lips parted slightly, as if she, too, was holding back words. "You were at my office the other day," he said finally, testing the waters. "The bakery delivery." She nodded, a small, controlled movement. "Yes, sir. Sweet Haven Bakery." Her tone was professional, but her eyes darted away, and he caught the slight tremor in her fingers. "Sir." The word was a wall, a reminder of the chasm between them, CEO and server, wealth and struggle. But it didn't feel right, not when her presence pulled at him like a tide. "You don't have to call me that," he said, softer now, almost a plea. "I'm Michael." He didn't know why he offered his name, why it mattered, but it did. Her gaze flicked back to his, and for a moment, the mask slipped. She looked at him, not the CEO, not the man in the suit, but the man who'd knelt beside her 6 years ago, who'd given her his umbrella. He saw it in her eyes, the recognition she couldn't hide, and his heart thudded, a drumbeat of something he wasn't ready to name. "Rebecca," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, as if the name itself was a confession. The word hit him like a spark, igniting a memory he'd buried. Rebecca. The waitress from the gala, the one who'd smiled at him like he was more than his name. He opened his mouth to speak, but a guest bumped into her, jostling her tray. Instinctively, he reached out, his hand steadying hers, their fingers brushing for the second time in days. The contact was brief, but it burned, and she pulled back, her cheeks flushing. "Sorry," she mumbled, stepping away, her composure fraying. He wanted to stop her, to ask her to stay, to ask why her face felt like a piece of his past, but the moment broke. Another server called her name, and she turned, her tray a shield between them. "Enjoy the evening," she said, her voice clipped, and then she was gone, swallowed by the crowd. He stood there, rooted, his hand still tingling where hers had been. Rebecca. The name echoed, pulling at threads of memory, broken glass, a rainy night, a smile that had haunted him. He didn't understand, not yet, but he knew she wasn't just a stranger. She was a key to something he'd locked away, something he'd lost. His eyes followed her as she moved through the room, her steps quick, her head bowed. He wanted to chase her, to demand answers, but the weight of the gala, the eyes on him, held him back. As the night wore on, he found himself distracted, his conversations half-hearted. He caught glimpses of her, refilling glasses, clearing plates, always just out of reach. Each time, his chest tightened, a mix of longing and unease. When the gala ended, he lingered, hoping for another chance to speak, but she was already gone, her absence a quiet ache. Driving home, the city lights blurring past, he couldn't shake her. Rebecca. The name was a whisper, a question. And then, unbidden, a phrase surfaced, one he hadn't thought of in years. If you ever need me, just say, champagne. He'd said it to her, half joking, that night under the awning. Had she remembered? Had she said it today, in the office, when their hands had touched? No, she hadn't. But the word lingered, a clue, a bridge to a past he was only beginning to recall. And as he stared into the night, he knew he couldn't let her slip away again. The morning after the gala, Alexander sat in his office, the city skyline a stark backdrop to the chaos in his mind. Rebecca. Her name was a pulse, steady and insistent, stirring memories he'd thought long buried. He hadn't slept, his thoughts tangled in the image of her eyes, the fleeting touch of her hand, the way she'd said his name, Michael, not Sir, as if she'd known him once. He didn't understand the pull, not fully, but it was there, undeniable, like a current dragging him toward a truth he wasn't ready to face. He needed to see her again. The bakery delivery had been a fluke, the gala a coincidence, but he couldn't rely on chance anymore. He called his assistant, his voice clipped. Find the bakery that catered the gala. Sweet Haven, I think. I want to discuss a contract for regular deliveries. It was a pretext, thin but plausible, and within hours, the bakery's owner was on the phone, eager to please. We'd be honored, the woman said, her voice bright. I can send someone to your office to finalize the details. Rebecca's our best, she handled your last order. Rebecca. The name hit him again, sharper this time. He agreed, his tone neutral, but his heart raced as he hung up. She'd be here, in his space, and this time, he wouldn't let her slip away without answers. When the appointment was set for the next morning, he found himself pacing, a restlessness he hadn't felt in years. He didn't know what he expected, clarity, maybe, or a spark of recognition that would make sense of the ache in his chest. All he knew was that she was a piece of his past, and he needed to understand why. The next day, Rebecca arrived at Lancaster Corp., her steps heavier than usual. She hadn't wanted this meeting, had tried to pass it off to someone else, but her boss insisted. It's a big account, she'd said. You're the one they asked for. Rebecca couldn't argue, not when every extra dollar meant new shoes for Lucas or a doctor's visit for Ethan's asthma. But as she rode the elevator to the top floor, her stomach churned. Michael Lancaster. The man from the gala, from 6 years ago, from a night she'd never quite let go. She didn't know if he remembered her, didn't know if she wanted him to, but the thought of facing him again made her feel exposed, raw. She stepped into his office, a cavern of glass and leather, and there he was, standing by the desk, his suit impeccable, his eyes locking onto hers the moment she entered. The air felt charged, heavy with unspoken questions. Ms. Harper, he said, his voice smooth but deliberate, as if testing her name. Thank you for coming. She nodded, clutching her notepad, her throat tight. Just Rebecca, she said, echoing their exchange at the gala, and his lips twitched, a ghost of a smile that made her heart stutter. They sat, the desk between them a barrier and a lifeline. He spoke first, outlining the contract, weekly deliveries, corporate events, standard terms, but his eyes never left her, searching, probing. She took notes, her pen moving mechanically, but her mind was elsewhere, caught in the cadence of his voice, the way his fingers tapped the desk, a habit she remembered from that rainy night. She tried to focus, to keep it professional, but every glance felt like a step toward a cliff she wasn't ready to leap from. Then it happened. As she handed him a sample menu, her sleeve slipped, revealing a thin red cord bracelet on her wrist, its threads faded but intact. She didn't notice at first, but Alexander did. His breath caught, his hand freezing mid-motion. He knew that bracelet. He'd tied it himself, 6 years ago, under a dripping awning, a playful gesture after she teased him about his umbrella. "Something to remember me by," he'd said, half laughing, never imagining it would matter. But there it was, on her wrist, a relic of a moment he'd thought was a dream. "You kept it," he said, his voice low, almost a whisper. Rebecca froze, her eyes flicking to her wrist, then to him. The room seemed to shrink, the contract forgotten. "What?" she asked, though she knew, her voice trembling. He leaned forward, his gaze intense, unguarded. "The bracelet. I gave it to you. That night, outside the gala. You were counting tips, and it was raining." Her heart pounded, her carefully built walls crumbling. He remembered. Not just her face, but the moment, the details, the way she'd felt alive under his gaze. She faltered, her fingers brushing the cord, a reflex. "It's just a bracelet." But it wasn't, and they both knew it. Her eyes met his, and for the first time, she saw him, not the CEO, not the stranger, but the man who'd knelt beside her, who'd made her believe, for one night, that she was more than her struggles. The weight of it was too much, and she looked away, her throat burning with unshed tears. "Why didn't you say anything?" he asked, his voice raw, a mix of frustration and something softer, something like longing. "At the bakery, at the gala, you knew who I was." She shook her head, her hands clenching in her lap. "What was I supposed to say? That I remembered a man who helped me 6 years ago? That I kept his bracelet like some kind of fool?" Her voice cracked, and she hated it, hated the vulnerability spilling out. He stood, rounding the desk, closing the distance between them. "You're not a fool," he said, his voice fierce. "I remembered you too. I didn't know why, but I did." He stopped, inches away, his hands hovering as if he wanted to reach for her but didn't dare. She looked up, her eyes glistening, and saw the same confusion, the same pull, reflected in his. "Who are you, Rebecca?" he asked, softer now, almost pleading. "Why do I feel like I've been looking for you my whole life?" She didn't answer, couldn't. The question hung between them, heavy with possibility and pain. She stood, her chair scraping softly, and stepped back, her breath uneven. "I should go," she said, her voice barely audible. "We'll finalize the contract later." He didn't stop her, but his eyes followed her, burning with questions neither of them could answer. As she left, the bracelet felt heavier, a tether to a past she couldn't escape, and she wondered how long she could keep running from the truth he was starting to see. Alexander's office was a tomb of silence that night, the city's glow muted through the tinted windows. He sat at his desk, the contract with Sweet Haven Bakery untouched, his scotch glass empty but for a ring of amber at the bottom. Rebecca's bracelet, that faded red cord, had cracked something open in him, a fault line in the armor he'd worn for years. Her words echoed, sharp and unyielding, that I kept his bracelet like some kind of fool. She'd remembered him, carried a piece of him, and he'd let her walk away again, her eyes haunted, her voice breaking. He couldn't let it end there. He leaned back, his mind spiraling to that rainy night 6 years ago, the gala, the awning, her smile. He'd thought it was a fleeting moment, a spark that had flickered out when he couldn't find her again. But now, seeing her, feeling the weight of her presence, he knew it was more. She was more. And the bracelet wasn't just a trinket, it was a promise, one he'd made and forgotten, one she'd kept. The realization was a blade, slicing through the numbness he'd cultivated. He stood, restless, and paced to the window, the city sprawling below like a map of his triumphs. But tonight, those victories felt hollow. He needed answers, needed to know why Rebecca's face stirred such a visceral ache, why her voice felt like a call he'd been ignoring. He returned to his desk, his hand brushing a stack of files, and one slipped, spilling papers across the floor. As he knelt to gather them, something caught his eye, a photograph, old and creased, tucked inside a forgotten folder. He froze, his breath catching. The photo was from the gala, a candid shot taken by a hired photographer. In it, he was crouching beside a woman, their hands brushing as they picked up broken glass. Her face was turned slightly, but it was her, Rebecca. Her eyes, even in the grainy image, held that same warmth, that same strength. He stared, his heart pounding, as fragments of that night flooded back, her quiet thank you, the way she'd stood unbroken despite the room's judgment. He'd kept this photo, though he couldn't remember why, buried in a file he hadn't touched in years. His hands trembled as he set the photo down, a memory surfacing, sharp and unbidden. After the gala, he'd gone back to the venue, asked about the waitress named Rebecca. The manager had shrugged, said she was a temp, no contact information. He'd let it go, told himself it didn't matter, but the truth was he'd been afraid of what she made him feel, afraid of a life where he wasn't in control. Now, that choice felt like a betrayal, not just of her, but of himself. He grabbed his phone, dialing his assistant, his voice urgent. "I need everything you can find on Rebecca Harper. Sweet Haven Bakery, previous jobs, anything. Now." His assistant, used to late-night demands, promised to dig, but Alexander couldn't wait. He opened his laptop, searching her name, the bakery, anything that might lead to her. The results were sparse, a mention in a local paper about the bakery's community outreach, a blurry group photo where she stood in the background, her smile faint but unmistakable. It wasn't enough. Then, a knock at the door. His night security guard, an older man named Carl who'd been with the company for decades, poked his head in. "Sir, you left this in the conference room." He held out a small notebook, its cover worn, its pages yellowed. Alexander frowned, taking it. "It's not mine," he said, but Carl shook his head. "It was with the bakery delivery stuff. Figured it belonged to that woman you met with. Rebecca." Alexander's pulse quickened as he opened it, the first page revealing neat, slanted handwriting. Her handwriting. He dismissed Carl with a nod, his hands shaking as he turned the pages. It was a journal, or something like it, filled with Rebecca's thoughts, her days, her dreams. One entry, dated a month after the gala, stopped him cold. "He didn't have to help me, but he did. I keep thinking about his eyes, like he was searching for something. I wonder if he found it. I wonder if I'll ever see him again." His chest tightened, a mix of awe and guilt. She'd written about him, carried him in her heart, while he'd buried her in his past. He read on, each word a window into her world, a world of struggle, of love for her sister, of quiet hopes she rarely voiced. Another entry, years later, mentioned a man who'd changed her life, a man she'd loved and lost. "He didn't know," she wrote, "but he gave me more than he'll ever understand." Alexander's throat burned. Was it him? Had their paths crossed again, in ways he hadn't seen? The journal didn't name him, but the weight of her words felt personal, intimate, as if written for him to find. He slammed the notebook shut, his breath ragged. If Rebecca was the woman from the gala, if she'd kept his bracelet, his memory, then what had he missed? What had he done? He grabbed his coat, his mind racing. He needed to find her, to ask her, to understand. He called her number, the one listed in the bakery's contact, but it went to voicemail. He tried again, then again, each unanswered ring a hammer against his resolve. As he stepped into the elevator, the journal clutched in his hand, a single thought consumed him: if she's the one I let go, then I've been wrong about everything. The bracelet, the photo, her words, they were pieces of a puzzle he was only beginning to see, and the picture they formed was one of loss, of love, of a life he might have had. He didn't know what came next, didn't know if she'd forgive him for forgetting, but he knew he couldn't stop now. Not when her voice, her eyes, her heart were calling him back to a truth he'd ignored for too long. The bakery was quiet, its counters gleaming under the fluorescent lights, the air thick with the scent of fresh bread. Rebecca stood behind the register, her hands steady as she rang up a customer, but her mind was a storm. The journal, her journal, was gone. She'd realized it that morning, retracing her steps, her heart sinking as she remembered the meeting at Lancaster Corp. It must have fallen from her bag, left behind in Michael's office, its pages bearing her soul to a man she wasn't ready to face. She'd called, left a vague message about a lost item, but the thought of him reading her words, her secrets, made her feel stripped bare. She didn't know he was coming. The bell above the bakery door chimed, and she looked up, her breath catching as Alexander stepped inside. He was out of place here, his tailored coat too sharp for the worn linoleum, his eyes too intense for the soft hum of the morning crowd. He held something in his hand, her journal, and the sight of it sent a jolt through her, fear and defiance warring in her chest. She straightened, wiping her hands on her apron, and met his gaze. "Mr. Lancaster," she said, her voice cool, a shield. "Can I help you?" He didn't answer right away. His eyes searched hers, raw and unguarded, as if he were seeing her for the first time. He stepped closer, the journal clutched like a lifeline, and when he spoke, his voice was low, strained. "This is yours," he said, holding it out. "I read it. I'm sorry, I shouldn't have, but... Rebecca, who are you to me?" The question was a blade, cutting through the space between them, and she felt it, sharp and deep. She didn't take the journal, didn't move, her hands gripping the counter to keep from trembling. "You don't get to ask that," she said, her voice shaking despite herself. "You don't get to walk in here, holding my life in your hands, and demand answers." Her eyes burned, but she refused to cry, refused to let him see how much he'd unraveled her. He flinched, but he didn't back down, his gaze steady, pleading. "I need to know," he said. "The bracelet, the gala, your words in here," he tapped the journal, his voice breaking. "You wrote about a man you loved, a man who left you. Was it me? Did I hurt you?" The question hung heavy, a truth she'd carried for years, a wound she'd bandaged but never healed. She wanted to lie, to send him away, to protect the life she'd built without him. But his eyes, the same eyes that had seen her 6 years ago, held her, and she couldn't look away. "You didn't hurt me," she said finally, her voice barely audible. "You just forgot me." The words were a confession, a release, and they broke something in her, the dam she'd built around her heart. Alexander's face crumpled, a mix of shock and guilt. "Forgot you?" he repeated, stepping closer, the counter the only barrier between them. "Rebecca, I looked for you. After the gala, I went back, asked about you, but they said you were gone. I thought," he stopped, his hands clenching, the journal bending under his grip. "I thought you were a moment, a dream. But you weren't. You were real, and I let you go." She laughed, a bitter sound that surprised her. "A dream?" she said, her voice rising. "You were a dream, Michael. You were the man who made me believe, for one night, that I could be more than this." She gestured to the bakery, to her apron, to the weight of her life. "But then you were gone, and I was still here, picking up the pieces. And I did. I had to." Her voice cracked, and she hated it, hated the tears that spilled despite her will. He set the journal down, his hands shaking, and leaned across the counter, his voice urgent. "Tell me what happened. Please. I need to know what I did, what I missed." She shook her head, stepping back, her heart a riot of pain and memory. But he didn't stop. "Rebecca, I see you now. I see the bracelet, the way you looked at me, the way you wrote about me. I was a fool, but I'm here. Tell me." She closed her eyes, the weight of 6 years pressing down, nights alone, mornings with her boys, the love she'd carried for a man who'd become a ghost. When she opened them, he was still there, waiting, and she knew she couldn't run anymore. "6 years ago," she said, her voice trembling, "we didn't just meet at the gala. We spent a night together, after the rain, in a diner down the street. You talked about your dreams, I talked about mine. You promised you'd find me again. And then, you didn't." His face paled, memories flickering like shadows. He remembered now, the diner, her laughter, the way she'd leaned across the table, her hand brushing his. It had been real, not a dream, and he'd let it slip away. "Rebecca," he whispered, but she wasn't done. She reached into her bag, her hand steady now, and pulled out a folded paper, worn from years of handling. She slid it across the counter, her eyes never leaving his. He unfolded it, his breath hitching. It was a birth certificate, 2 names listed, Ethan Harper, Lucas Harper. And below, in the space for the father, Michael Alexander Lancaster. His vision blurred, the paper trembling in his hands. "They're mine?" he asked, his voice a broken thing. She nodded, tears streaming down her face. "They're ours. I tried to find you, but you were gone. So I raised them, loved them, gave them everything I had. And I never told them you forgot us." He staggered back, the truth a tidal wave, drowning him. Ethan. Lucas. The boys at the grave, calling him Dad. His sons. He'd had a family, a life, and he'd walked away, blind to it all. "Rebecca," he choked, but she shook her head, stepping around the counter, her voice firm. "I didn't tell you to hurt you. I told you because you asked. But I can't do this again, Michael. I can't hope and lose you twice." She walked past him, out the door, the bell chiming softly. He stood frozen, the birth certificate in his hand, her journal on the counter, the weight of his failure crushing him. She was gone, and with her, the family he'd never known he had. But as the door swung shut, he knew this wasn't the end. Not yet. Not when he'd finally seen the truth. The penthouse was a mausoleum of glass and steel, its silence louder than any noise. Alexander sat on the edge of his leather couch, the city's skyline a cold witness to the wreckage within him. The birth certificate lay on the coffee table, its edges worn, the names, Ethan Harper, Lucas Harper, Michael Alexander Lancaster, burning into his vision. His sons. Rebecca's sons. Their sons. The truth was a weight he couldn't carry, yet couldn't set down. She'd stood before him, her voice steady, her eyes raw, and told him everything, the night they'd shared, the promises he'd broken, the family he'd never known. And then she'd walked away, leaving him with nothing but the echo of her pain. He hadn't moved for hours, the darkness of the room matching the darkness in his chest. The journal, the bracelet, the photo from the gala, they were all pieces of a life he'd ignored, a love he'd let slip through his fingers. He thought of Rebecca's words, "I didn't tell you to hurt you. I told you because you asked." She hadn't wanted revenge, hadn't wanted to break him, but she had. Not with anger, but with the quiet truth of her strength, her survival, her love for their boys. He'd been a fool, building an empire while she'd built a family, and he'd missed it all. His phone buzzed, a string of missed calls from his assistant, but he ignored it. Work, deals, power, they meant nothing now. He picked up the birth certificate, tracing the names with his finger. Ethan. Lucas. He saw their faces at the grave, their eyes so like Rebecca's, their trust so like his own, before life had hardened him. Dad, they'd called him, and he'd stood there, blind to the truth, blind to them. The memory was a knife, twisting deeper with each breath. He'd failed them, failed her, failed himself. He stood, his legs unsteady, and walked to the window, the city sprawling below, indifferent. He'd always thought wealth was armor, that it could shield him from pain, from loss. But it hadn't. It had blinded him, made him believe he could walk away from Rebecca, from love, without consequence. Now, the consequence was here, in the shape of 2 boys who didn't know him, a woman who'd loved him and lost him, a life he'd never lived. He pressed his forehead against the glass, the cold grounding him, and made a decision. He couldn't undo the past, but he could fight for the future. He grabbed his coat, the birth certificate still in his hand, and drove to the bakery. It was closed, the windows dark, but he knocked anyway, his fist pounding against the glass. No answer. He tried her number again, the voicemail a familiar sting. "Rebecca," he said, his voice rough, "I know I don't deserve it, but I need to see you. I need to make this right. Please." He hung up, his breath fogging in the night air, and drove to the address his assistant had found, a rundown apartment building on the city's edge, where Rebecca had lived until recently. The landlord, a weary woman with a cigarette dangling from her lips, eyed him suspiciously. "She's gone," she said, exhaling smoke. "Moved out yesterday. Didn't say where." Alexander's heart sank, but he pressed her, slipping $100 bill into her hand. She shrugged, unimpressed, but pointed to a box in the corner. "She left that. Said to toss it if no one came." He took it, his hands shaking, and opened it in the dim hallway. Inside was a child's drawing, crayon lines forming a man in a suit, a boy holding his hand. Below, in shaky letters, "For Daddy." His knees buckled, and he sank to the floor, the drawing clutched to his chest. Ethan or Lucas had drawn this, had imagined him, had hoped for him. He saw Rebecca's hand in it, her voice telling them stories of a father who'd come back, even when she'd stopped believing it herself. The weight of her love, her sacrifice, was unbearable. She'd raised their sons alone, given them hope when he'd given her nothing, and still, she'd protected his memory for them. He drove aimlessly, the drawing on the passenger seat, his mind a loop of regrets. He thought of the gala, her smile under the awning, the night in the diner when they talked until dawn. He'd felt alive then, seen in a way he'd never been, but he'd walked away, convinced his world would ruin her. Now, he saw the truth, he'd ruined her by leaving, by assuming she needed less of him when she'd needed all of him. He pulled over, his hands gripping the wheel, and let the tears come, hot and unyielding, the first he'd shed in years. He didn't know where she was, didn't know if she'd forgive him, but he knew he couldn't stop. He drove to the shelter where Ethan and Lucas had been, a gray building with peeling paint and a flickering sign. The woman at the desk was kind but firm. "They're not here anymore," she said. "Their mother took them. She didn't leave a forwarding address." Alexander's heart twisted, but he nodded, leaving his card. "If you hear from her, tell her I'm looking. Tell her I'll never stop." Back in his car, he opened a journal again, flipping to a page he'd skipped before. "I don't hate him," Rebecca had written, "but I can't keep hoping. Ethan asks about his dad, and I lie, because the truth hurts too much. Maybe one day, he'll find us. Maybe one day, he'll care." The words were a mirror, reflecting his failures, but also a spark, a chance. She'd hoped once. She might hope again. He drove into the night, the city a blur, his resolve hardening. "I'm here now," he whispered, to her, to the boys, to the man he wanted to be. "I care. And I'll find you, no matter how long it takes." The road stretched ahead, uncertain but not empty, and for the first time in years, Alexander felt something like purpose, a fire kindled by loss, by love, by the family he'd failed but wouldn't abandon again. The city was softer in the early morning, its edges blurred by a mist that clung to the streets like a whispered promise. Alexander drove slowly, his eyes scanning every corner, every face, as if Rebecca and the boys might appear from the haze. Weeks had passed since the bakery, since the truth of Ethan and Lucas had shattered his world. He'd searched tirelessly, shelters, schools, old addresses, chasing fragments of her life, each dead end a bruise on his heart. The drawing from the apartment, the crayon sketch of a father and son, sat on his dashboard, a talisman, a reminder of what he'd lost and what he still hoped to find. He'd changed in those weeks, though he barely recognized it himself. The man who'd once measured his worth in stock prices and headlines now carried a quiet humility, a hunger for something deeper than power. He'd sold his penthouse, donated half his fortune to shelters and youth programs, actions that felt less like atonement and more like steps toward the man he wanted to be, for Rebecca, for their sons, for himself. But without them, it was all hollow, a gesture to a void he couldn't fill. He stopped at a park, one he'd heard mentioned by the shelter staff, a place where families gathered on weekends. It was early, the grass still wet with dew, the air cool and sharp. He stepped out, the drawing in his pocket, and walked the winding paths, his breath visible in the morning chill. The park was waking, joggers, dog walkers, a few children chasing pigeons, but he felt alone, a stranger in a world that moved on without him. He sat on a bench, his hands clasped, and closed his eyes, letting the sounds of the park wash over him, a faint hope flickering in his chest. A child's laugh broke through, bright and unguarded, and his eyes snapped open. Across the field, a boy ran, his scarf trailing like a comet's tail. Ethan. Alexander's heart leapt, his body moving before his mind caught up. He stood, scanning the crowd, and there, near a cluster of trees, was Rebecca. She sat on a blanket, a book in her lap, Lucas beside her, his stuffed bear tucked under his arm. They were here, real, alive, and for a moment, Alexander couldn't breathe, the sight of them a miracle he hadn't dared to imagine. He didn't approach, not yet. He watched from a distance, his throat tight, as Rebecca read to Lucas, her voice soft, her hand brushing his hair. Ethan kicked a ball nearby, his laughter echoing, and Alexander saw himself in the boy's reckless joy, in the way he moved without fear. They were his, but more than that, they were hers, her strength, her love, her light. He felt like an intruder, a man who'd stumbled into a story that wasn't his, but he couldn't walk away. Not again. Ethan's ball rolled too far, bouncing toward Alexander's feet. He bent to pick it up, his hands trembling, and when he looked up, Ethan was there, his eyes wide and curious. "Hey, mister," the boy said, tilting his head. "You look like someone I know." Alexander's heart stopped, the drawing in his pocket burning like a brand. He knelt, holding the ball, his voice barely steady. "Do I?" he asked, his eyes searching Ethan's, finding echoes of his own. Before Ethan could answer, Lucas appeared, clutching his bear, his gaze wary but intrigued. "Ethan, come back," he called, then froze, staring at Alexander. The recognition in his eyes was a jolt, a bridge to the graveyard, to the moment they'd called him Dad. Rebecca looked up, her book slipping from her hands, and their eyes met across the field. Time slowed, the park fading, the world narrowing to just them. She stood, her movement slow, as if testing the ground beneath her, and walked toward him, Lucas trailing behind. She stopped a few feet away, her arms crossed, her face a mask of exhaustion and resolve. "Michael," she said, her voice quiet but firm, a name that carried 6 years of pain and possibility. He rose, the ball still in his hands, and took a step closer, his heart pounding. "Rebecca," he said, his voice raw. "I've been looking for you. For them." He glanced at the boys, who watched with wide eyes, sensing the weight of the moment. She didn't speak, her eyes searching his, looking for the man she'd once known, the man she'd written about in her journal. "Why?" she asked finally, her voice trembling. "Why now?" He swallowed, the words he'd rehearsed dissolving. "Because I was wrong," he said. "I thought I was protecting you by leaving, but I was protecting myself. I didn't know about them, about us. But I know now, and I can't live with the man I was. I want to be the man they need, the man you deserved." Her eyes glistened, but she didn't cry. She looked at Ethan and Lucas, their small hands gripping each other's, and then back at him. "They don't know you," she said, her voice soft but sharp. "I told them stories, gave them hope, but you weren't there. I won't let you hurt them." The words were a shield, but he saw the crack in it, the part of her that still remembered the diner, the rain, the promises. "I won't," he said, his voice breaking. "I don't deserve your trust, but I'll earn it. For them. For you." He pulled the drawing from his pocket, unfolding it gently. "Ethan or Lucas made this. It's me, isn't it? They hoped for me, even when I didn't know they existed. Let me hope for them now." He held it out, his hand shaking, and she took it, her fingers brushing his, a spark in the quiet. She stared at the drawing, her breath hitching, and Lucas stepped forward, his bear dangling. "Is that you?" he asked, his voice small but clear. Alexander knelt, meeting his eyes. "I want it to be," he said. "If you'll let me." Ethan tugged Rebecca's sleeve, his scar catching the light. "Mom, is he?" He didn't finish, but she knew, and so did Alexander. Rebecca's shoulders sagged, the weight of years softening. She didn't speak, didn't promise, but she reached out, her hand resting on his arm, a touch that said more than words. The boys moved closer, their curiosity outweighing their caution, and Alexander felt it, a connection, fragile but real, a chance to rebuild what he'd broken. The mist lifted, the sun breaking through, and as they stood there, a family not yet whole but no longer apart, he knew this was the beginning, not the end. The road ahead was long, but he'd walk it, step by step, with them.